You know, many people today actually differentiate bosses from leaders. Some people say it's just nomenclature, but I think behind it there's a certain mentality and a certain idea behind it. Let me just show you what these people say. He says that, next please, that a boss drives people, but a leader coaches them. A boss depends on his title, his position, and his seniority, whereas a leader depends on goodwill. A boss knows, but the leader shows. The boss says I, the leader says we. The boss uses people, but the leader grows people. The boss takes credit, the leader gives credit. The boss puts blame, and the leader takes blame. So essentially behind this whole idea is really whether the style and the approach we take towards leadership is one that is leader-oriented or it is a follower-oriented approach. And I guess it's a good checklist for us to ask ourselves whether we are more like bosses or we are more like leaders. But you know, in all of these theories, when people present out a certain model, they'll try to bring the extreme good of something and they'll bring the extreme bad of something, right? So for example, in order to bring across the whole idea that the follower-oriented approach is the way to go, you bring out the extreme good of this approach. And of course, you then bring the extreme bad in the leader-oriented approach. But we all know, next please, that in all things, there's a range from very bad to very good. Right? So there are actually some good to a leader-oriented approach, and there is also some bad to a follower-oriented approach. And so you then see, for example, in a crisis situation, what we need is we need a person who is a very strong leader, who is able to give the direction, give the instructions so that everybody kind of like fall in place. So in times like that, actually a leader-oriented approach may be important. Or when you are actually leading a group of people and the people are young, they're immature, you may actually need a leader who is very strong. Conversely, not necessarily all follower-oriented approach are good, because sometimes the person can come across as a people pleaser. You know, you just want to please everyone. You may come across as very indecisive, you can come across as very slow, and sometimes you can come across as a person without direction, without vision. And so what it actually highlights is that we all have different perspectives and we all have different views regarding authority. But somehow, whenever we use the word authority, it gives a negative connotation, right? And hence, I've titled it, That's Just What You Say. Because when I'm really upset with people who are above us, I was like, whatever lah. That's just what you say, right? It's really an issue about authority. So today, we want to take a look at the topic of authority, and in particular, the authority of Jesus Christ. We're going to look at Mark chapter 11, verses 27 to 12:27. That's really a long passage, but let me just do my best to do it all within 40 minutes, all right? Let me just do a quick recap for those of you who are just coming on board to join us. We are right in the middle of a book called the book of Mark, and we are in chapter 11. And we are actually coming right in the middle of the chapter. So how did this chapter begin? This chapter began with Jesus entering into this city called Jerusalem. And he was riding on a donkey. And as he was going into this city, he was actually hailed as king, a true descendant of David. And we see that in chapter 11, verses 8 to 10, that many people were spreading their cloaks on the road, and they spread branches and so on. And those who came actually were all shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is he who comes to bring God's kingdom through our father David. But you see, very, very shortly, the crowd's welcome is followed by the Jewish leaders' opposition. There's a group of leaders, while you see the crowd welcoming Jesus, they're really unhappy about what's happening. And they are plotting and conspiring. And we know, as you read on in the rest of the book of Mark, that they actually brought about the death of Christ. So with that as a kind of like a backdrop, how do we make sense of Mark 11:27 to 12:27? Well, basically, it's about three groups of religious leaders asking three questions. Sorry, today this is wonky. Maybe I'm wonky. Okay. And basically, this passage has three groups of leaders asking 3 questions. So for us to make sense of this long chapter, don't get into all the details. There are essentially just 3 questions, all right, by 3 groups of people. The first question is, by what authority doest thou these things? Second question, is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? And third, in the resurrection, in this scenario that the Sadducees present, whose wife shall she be of them? Basically, I have kind of like rephrased it into the outline that is given to you, that the first question coincides with the whole idea of the religious leaders questioning Jesus regarding his supreme authority. What is the basis of his authority? Is it from God? So they're actually putting in question Jesus' supreme authority from God. Next. But before we look at the second question, in between the first and second question, Jesus narrated a parable. All right? And in chapter 12, verses 1 to 12, you will see Jesus Christ talking about a parable. And essentially, this parable talks about owner and some tenants. And the key to the parable is that the tenants were hostile. And the parable is about the fact that their hostility is senseless. All right? So after answering the first question, he narrated a parable. And then in chapter 12, Jesus goes on to answer 2 other questions. Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar? Here we see the Pharisees and Herodians questioning Jesus regarding the secular duty towards Caesar. And finally, the last question, the Sadducees then question Jesus regarding this whole reality of what the resurrection is about. So in your outline, I've given to you 4 main sections that we will be covering. All right, and we will look at each of these sections with some detail. All right, so with that, let's take a look at the first section, which is from 27 to 32. So we know that it began with a group of religious leaders asking Jesus this question: who gave you the right to do all these things? So what is the basis of your authority? So at this point, Jesus rightly, instead of answering their question, answered them with another question. Next. So, okay, before I answer you the question, who gave me the right to do these things? Maybe I should ask you. There is this guy, John, if you know he's a prophet, who gave him the right to baptize. So we know from the text, next, that the religious leaders said, we don't know. We don't know the answer to your question. But it's not that they don't know. Next, what you see is that they refuse to say that John is from God. Because if they say, John is from God, then Jesus says to them, why is it that if John is from God, you're not listening to him? But they can't say he's not from God, because everybody knows that John is from God. So therefore, the safest and the most politically correct answer is, we don't know. So Jesus says, fine, next. Then I also want to answer you. Here in this text, we see that the Pharisees, the religious leaders have already chosen to not trust Jesus' authority. They already decided to put the authority in question. Their questioning is not because they want to clarify. They were all there to set a trap. So they were not really interested. They were just there to set a trap for Jesus, because deep down inside, from the conversation, you know that they are already not putting their trust in the authority of Jesus. Next. Which leads me to my first point. We can choose to doubt Jesus' authority. We can choose to put Jesus' authority in question. And I think that oftentimes we can be like that in general as well. So I asked myself when I was preparing this, how do I sometimes not take a person in charge seriously? Or why don't I take a person in charge seriously? Right? It's announced, so and so will now be in charge. And sometimes, when I listen to the announcement, I'll be like, yeah, right? So why do I feel that way? Maybe because I think that the person is not qualified for the job. Right? They should have asked me. But they asked him. So, okay, fine. I think I know better. Sometimes I think that I'm more qualified, I'm more experienced compared to that guy. Or maybe the guy who come in is, in our words, a helicoptered in, he's a newbie, he's noob, he's much younger, our pride is hurt. And so we don't take the person who is in charge seriously. Well, when I was going through reservist training, there are many leaders that I have to work under, and they change every 3 to 5 years. because these are regular soldiers, and in keeping with their the kind of track that MINDEF has planned for them, every 3 to 5 years, they will then change the leaders. So I have to work under different leaders every 3 to 5 years. And of course, I always find out who's the new leader, right? Because most important is, when do I in pro and when do I out pro? I mean, when do I get into the army and when can I leave the army quickly? And of course, the kind of leaders will affect my 30 days or 3 weeks of reservist training. The rest of the year is fine, but at least that 30 days or that 3 weeks, it should be pleasant, right? And you know, as usual, you have all different kinds of leaders. And there was one time, there's a talk around, oh, this leader who's coming is very good. And I'll be like, okay, yeah, same old, yeah, good, you know. They always say that, right? But they always turn out same old. But this particular leader who came, he was really very good. He was so good that we among us, some of my friends were joking that if Singapore goes to war, we want him to lead us to war, because I know that I'll come back alive with him. Even if I come back dead, I'll be in one piece. I'm not sure about the other people if I go out war with. You see, my friends, we all want to work under good leaders, isn't it? But even the best of human leaders aren't perfect. But there is a perfect leader that Christians believe in. It's the person Jesus. His authority is absolute. He's absolutely good. He's absolutely powerful. We have read, if you have been with us right through Mark 1 to 10, you have seen the different things that Jesus Christ has done. Mark is to present to us how powerful Jesus is. As you read on in the book of Mark, you will see how Jesus dies for us. And you'll see how good Jesus is and how loving he is. But yet, we can still choose to say, thanks, but no thanks. We can still doubt his authority. My friends, it will be to our great loss if we do not live under the authority of Jesus Christ. It will be our great loss if we choose to doubt his authority even before we give it a shot. The first thing I'd like to share with us is, my friends, even for those of us who have been growing up in church, we can choose to doubt Jesus' authority. And that is not something that is encouraged, but just to tell us that that is a fact. And Jesus actually then went on to say that as much as Jesus is good, Jesus is powerful, there are people who will doubt and who will reject his authority. And that is why he then narrated the parable. The parable regarding the senseless hostility of evil tenants. And let me just briefly tell you what the parable is about. It's about a man who planted a vineyard, and the vineyard was fruitful, and he decided to lease it out to tenants to help take care for him while he is away. Next. Then at harvest time, he then sent some of his servants, since he's away, back to his vineyard to collect his share. So the tenants have their share, and the owners actually got the servants to collect back his share, and rightly so, because the vineyard is his. But what did the tenants do? The tenants actually beat up every servant that was sent back and sent them back empty-handed. And the Bible tells us that the third servant in the parable that Jesus mentioned, they even killed that servant. It's almost like saying to the owner, don't bother sending anybody back, because whoever they come back, they will come back empty-handed. If not, they will be dead. They won't even come back, right? So don't bother. So the owner said, fine, since you're going to kill all my workers, right, I will send my son. Maybe they'll give my son face, right? Sorry, give me face, right? And then through my son. Then the tenants were thinking, well, this is son who is the heir to the father. If we kill him, right, that means we actually could land up having this whole vineyard to ourselves. So they plotted and they killed the son. So when you read a parable like this, you'll be like, what? I mean, are there people like that? So this is a parable, all right? It's a story that Jesus told. Essentially, is to highlight that the owner is kind, the owner is reasonable, the owner is fair. But the tenants are ungrateful, the tenants are unreasonable, And that's why I entitled this parable, The Senseless Hostility of the Evil Tenants. They are unreasonable, they are mean, and they are ungrateful. You see, my friends, next, not only can we choose to doubt Jesus' authority, we can, like the evil tenants, defy Jesus' authority. To literally tell Jesus, that's just what you say. So I also ask myself, under what circumstances do I defy authority? Now, just in case you look at me and think that I'm very, very compliant. Yes, I am, but there are times when I'm a bit defiant. Sorry, not a bit. There are times that I'm defiant. So I ask myself, why do I defy authority? I think sometimes I defy authority when my interest is threatened. I defy authority when I insist on my rights. I defy authority when I'm unhappy. I'm just upset with whatever that has been given. I could defy authority because everybody else is doing it. So I'm just on the same wagon. Or sometimes, I give myself even a more noble reason. I defy authority for the sake of this group of people who are marginalized. So for their sake, right, I will defy the authority. So, I mean, we do it for all reasons, right? So a few days ago, World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic, as we all know. And the authorities are saying that the situation is so bad because many people in many countries are not taking the outbreak seriously enough. So there are reports of people who are tested positive in other countries and they are still walking about. There are people who are in contact with those who are tested positive and life basically just go on as usual for them. And so because of that, in some countries, the condition is worsening and is out of control. Well, you can't do that in Singapore. If you're given a stay-home notice or if you're given a quarantine order, you better stay home. Because the consequences of not being found where we're supposed to be will be very, very serious. Right? In the newspapers, we read of foreigners working here, sent home immediately, no questions asked, right? So we all know that in Singapore, we have to abide by the rules. But then again, if you think about it, the Singaporeans are not saying, wow, why so severe? You notice that while these rules are all set and we are all complying to it, we are not saying, wow, why is the penalty so severe? We know that it is fair, it is necessary. In fact, that's why we are so thankful we are in Singapore, because the situation is somewhat under control, right? Every other day you see the numbers climbing up, but it's still somewhat under control because it's under the watchful eyes of the leaders and they give instructions and people are expected to comply. Any rejection of the authority and the defiance to the authority will meet with very serious consequences. Now, if we can understand that, then it is not difficult to understand also, next, that if we defy the absolute authority of Jesus, who is good, powerful, and perfect, it's not difficult to see that defying his authority will have severe consequences, which Christians use the word judgment. Because you are actually challenging God who has the absolute authority. And so the parable ends off with a very serious note that the owner will come and destroy the tenants. Because the stone which the builders reject, which is the cornerstone, will prove to be the head of the corner. That when you reject the cornerstone, you are knocking at the pillar of the building. What's going to happen? The building will collapse. It's not just any stone. You are talking about the foundational stone. And so it is reasonable and it is fair that Scripture says that if we choose to doubt or defy his authority, there will be consequences. But conversely, if we were to embrace the authority of Jesus in our life and to let Jesus rule in our life, there are, in some sense, advantages, or the way by which we should live is actually told to us if we were to put Jesus as the ruler of our lives. And in this particular aspect, I'd like to cover it under chapter 12, verse 13, on questions regarding secular duty, as well as 12:18 on the reality of resurrection. So the first two sections reminds us that we can doubt Jesus' authority, we can defy Jesus' authority, but it will come with severe consequences. But if we do submit to the rule of Jesus, he does help us understand how we should live. So with this, let's transit to the third account. Here, we see the Pharisees and Herodians questioning Jesus regarding the secular duty to Caesar. So they then came up to Jesus and they say, should we pay taxes? Now that's a very touchy question. You know, today, if you work in the income tax department, there are people who may just avoid you as well. Because tax is actually a very sensitive topic, right? And so they then raise this question, should we pay taxes? Next, just a little bit of background. The Pharisees are people who are very legalistic. They're trying to trap Jesus. They're hoping that Jesus will say something like, yes, you should pay taxes, and then they can then try to find a way to see, then how do we square that with our devotion to God? How about our devotion to, in terms of the gifts that we must give to God in the temple and so on. So they're trying to trap Jesus in that light. The Herodians, on the other hand, are people who are pro-government, pro-Herod. So they're hoping that Jesus will say something like, no, you don't have to pay taxes, and then they will catch him to see that he is actually not patriotic as a citizen. And so you then have two groups of people, each waiting for Jesus to say an answer so that they can trap him. So you can see here that it is very clear that there are groups of people who have already chosen not to accept Jesus' authority, and they're thinking of ways and means to doubt and to defy. So Jesus' answer is, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Give to God what belongs to God. This tells us that if we embrace Jesus' authority next, Jesus can help us understand our duties in life. You see, my friends, the Bible, this book that Christians value tremendously, let me tell you what essentially it's about. It tells us really about how God saved us as his people. Really, the key idea behind the Bible is to tell us how God saved us as his people. But there are ideas building upon this main idea. And what are some of these other ideas? That as we are saved as God's people, we are then given principles and instructions on how we should live. How we should live in society, how we should live and relate with one another. And so there is at the heart of this the story of God saving his people, but leading to principles and instructions on how we should live. And so if we embrace the authority of Jesus, we will know how to give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God. Because it does teach us how we can understand and fulfill our duties in life. If I can extend this idea a little bit, you see, my friends, in life, there are different domains. What do I mean? So there's school, there is work, the company that you work for. If you're in the army, there is the army. Different government sectors. We have a family as an institution. Of course, there are religious institutions. So we then have different domains. And each domain, or each institution, has its own set of leaders, own set of rules, and their own ways of doing things, right? So every organization has that. But the sad part is organizations don't always have the best leaders. Organizations don't necessarily have the best practices. And we, sometimes are caught under those situations. Maybe you're in a workplace and you're very upset with whatever that's happening in your company. Or you're serving your national service and you're very upset that you are a son of Singapore. You know how you wish you are a daughter and then you don't have to serve national service. And you have to do that for your full cycle. So for various reasons, you are put into places where you're really upset. And sometimes, because we don't have the best leaders, we don't have the best practices, we find that things are so unfair. We're very frustrated. And I think sometimes you're like, it's so ridiculous, right? Almost like, wow, like that also can, right? So you have all this angst in us. So under those circumstances, what do? Well, the normal reaction is to do what you think makes the most sense. But you see, that's where the problem is. Because everyone is doing what they think makes the most sense for themselves. And that is why the problem aggravates. In Singapore today, I kind of think that if you want to get something done, you just need to complain. In fact, the louder your complaint, the higher your chance of getting it done. And so after a while, people learn. I complain, I get things done. So I complain. But after a while, everybody start complaining. So you have to prioritize, right? Because everybody complain. So you then learn, I must shout louder. Because louder, then you'll be put up on the priority list, correct? So we then realize our society, right? Begin to see trends and signs of many people shouting and shouting, either literally or metaphorically. It's only good up to a certain point. Because if you get shouted at, what is it like? We think about the shouting, but have you thought about what is it like to be shouted at every day if you're in the service industry? It doesn't make sense, isn't it? But everybody is just doing whatever that makes the most sense. But you see, the Bible doesn't teach us that is how we should do it. So it just not only does it teach us what we should do, it also go about teaching us how we should go about doing it. And so in any organization, there are many layers. The Bible tells us, know what your role is in society, know what your role is in an organization, and play that role. Because some things are not within your scope. Then let people who watches that scope do what they're supposed to do. We support, work through issues based on the scope that we are given. If you're a leader, you are responsible to work through, in a good way, all that you've been entrusted. If you're a follower, if you're a member, if you're a worker, then you've got to learn to work through issues similarly. And the Bible has instructions on how we can understand these duties and to play it out in life. So as we embrace the authority of Jesus, we also understand how to fulfill duties in our life. Finally, let me just cover the last bit. The Sadducees actually questioned Jesus regarding the spiritual reality of resurrection. Before we go into the scenario, I think you may need to know a little bit of a background. There is in the Old Testament a law, next, and it is regarding this phrase called the levirate marriage. And in this arrangement, basically what it means is if a man is married to his wife and the man dies, his brother is obliged to take care of the wife, next, as well as her children. So although even whatever properties that this brother now has, legally now goes under the man. All right, this is just a rule that is set up in the Old Testament to make sure that the people are taken care of in those times. So the Sadducees then use this, next, to then paint a scenario. He says, let's say, for example, now a man marries a wife, right? And then this man died. So now the brother marries the wife, right? Okay, now the brother died. So another brother marries the wife, right? And then it goes on, right? Wow, now you have, this wife has married 7 people. And so, The Sadducees then asked Jesus, if there's such thing called resurrection, right? Then in the resurrection, whose wife is she? Now this, when you first read it, right, sounds a bit funny, amusing, but it seems like there's some logic to it as well. But the key to understanding this text is the Bible tells us that the Sadducees, next, don't believe in resurrection. So when they raise this question, they raise it in a form of, in a very sarcastic way, not so much to want to know the answer again, but to really see what Jesus has to say about resurrection, because to them it doesn't make sense. Next, so Jesus corrected them and said, you are religious leaders. You ask questions like that. You don't even read your scriptures well in the first place. Because if you read your scriptures well, you won't be asking that question. And you are really too fixated in your idea about things. You're not even open to listen to what the scripture has to say. Jesus then pointed out a few very key things. First, death isn't the end. There is this thing called life after death. And we shouldn't be surprised, because God is powerful. God can give us life. So certainly God can also grant life after death. Secondly, it is within God's design. Now, if you read the Bible carefully, the Old Testament implicitly teach about resurrection. The New Testament teach explicitly about resurrection. So you shouldn't be surprised by it, because it is within God's design, within His power, within His design. But life after death is a little bit like life today, but a little bit different from like life today. So, these issues of relationship and marriage will look slightly differently. So life after death is somewhat similar. Life after death is somewhat different. Basically, what I want to say is this. Next, if we were to take time to understand the Bible, submit our life to the rule of Christ, we can actually understand God's design of life. Life now and life after death. So not only can we understand our duties and play them well, we can also understand how God designed life and life after death. See, we all look at life differently. This is what R.C. Sproul says. We all have values. We all have viewpoints of what life is. We all have. He then made this statement: we are not all philosophers, but we all have a philosophy. Now, whenever you see the word philosophy, we are quite scared of the word because it's like a very big word. But what R.C. Sproul is saying is that although many of us don't grapple into this philosophy and much talk about it, all of us have a certain idea and a view about life, certain philosophy of life. And we actually live it out whether you know you have it or you don't. And how you live actually reveals your conviction about life. So, for example, you can take a very pragmatic approach to life. You can take a very relativistic approach to life. But in any case, you must take a view that makes the most sense for you, for your life, and for all that's happening around the world, including today's pandemic. Your life view must be big enough to help you make sense of your life, what's happening around, and everything that there is. But many of the life views have their limitations. For example, there are some of us who could take a very pragmatic view to life. In other words, if this serves my purpose, I'll embrace it. If it doesn't, don't waste my time. Well, it sounds fair enough that if it's not something that is worth your time, you dismiss it. But my friends, have you ever been dismissed by people before? And then you make a statement, why are you so pragmatic? But what's wrong if you are taking a pragmatic approach to life? Because that person is also taking the same approach that you take in life. You see, suddenly your life view is inadequate to explain your frustration when people dismiss you. Let's take a relativistic view. Some people say, I'm entitled to my opinion, you're entitled to yours. Let's not impose our views on one another. Fine, that's fair. But some people, because they do what they like, we suffer. And then, deep down inside, we have this idea that, no, people cannot just do what they like. Why not? You just took a relativistic view of life yourself. You just said that people are entitled to their own opinion, so people do what they like. But when we are now victims of people who takes that view, we are totally opposite. And we say, how can people be like that? But that's the view we take about life. You see, for me, I've found the most tenable and the most consistent life view to be the Christian life view. Although not all things match up, we don't understand fully everything, but I personally have found the Christian life view the most tenable and the most consistent. And people ask, so what is the Christian life view? Let me tell you what's the Christian life view. First, we look at life this way, that there is God, and God is the creator, and God is in control of all things in life. That's why when Pastor was leading us in prayer, we know that even in a pandemic, we know that God is in control. So for us, our Christian life view, we are not relativistic. We believe in absolute truth. We believe in God with absolute authority. Next, our life view is also one where we make sense of what's happening around us, that the rejection of God, His design, and His rule results in adverse consequences in this life. And not just adverse consequences, there will be a final judgment thereafter. So we are not essentially just moralistic. Always about doing good, helping people. Not essentially just that. We are not relativistic. We are not essentially moralistic. We look at our response to God, and if you choose to disrupt God's design, and you will have consequences, as we have mentioned in this current outbreak situation. Thirdly, Christians look at life to Christ, who came to take away the judgment by His death, and grant a life that is new and eternal by His resurrection. And Jesus does that not because we are worthy. He does it unconditionally because He loved us. So Christian's life view is not essentially pragmatic. It's not because you do this for God, so now God does this in return for you. It's not like that. He does it sacrificially, selflessly, out of love, to take away the judgment that is rightly ours, and to grant us a new life, and grant us an eternal life. And finally, we know that we can then live out our duty in life, and we can live out God's design of life when we live under the rule of Jesus. So life is not essentially just materialistic, just about gaining possessions. It's about underliving the rule of Christ so that we can know how to make sense of the things that we should do, and to make sense of what life is, the way God has designed it. You know, for friends who are joining us this morning and we have not yet kind of adopted this life view, well, it's something for you to consider. But let me just quickly summarize all that I want to say this morning. We started off by looking at this very long passage, but basically there are just four main ideas I'd like to share with you. First is that we can choose to doubt Jesus' authority. We can choose to defy His authority. I say you can choose. But with your choice, there will be effects, there will be consequences. Conversely, we can choose to embrace Jesus' authority. When we embrace His authority in life, we understand our duties. We also understand God's design of life, and then we can live it the way God has intended it. This morning's message is also for all of us who are at church. We've been singing so much songs about Jesus, not I, but Christ. But my question really is this. When our life shows that there's a difference between what I think and what the Bible says, what do we do? We read so much, we heard so much about the authority of Jesus, but really at the crunch, when what we think and how we act is different from what the Bible says, what do we do? How do we reconcile the differences? Because if we don't, we are actually not taking the authority of Jesus seriously enough. And so these are questions that's worthwhile in your Bible class to discuss. You can go through the material again. This PowerPoint is actually made available to all the Bible class teachers. They can forward it to you. But it's good not only just to cover the ideas and some of the principles that's been shared, but also to talk about really in practice, what happens when there is this difference? How do we reconcile this difference so that we can constantly live under the rule of Christ, under His authority? Let us pray together. Father, we thank you this morning that we can consider together as a church the topic on the authority, and in particular the authority of Jesus Christ. We thank you that your word constantly reminds us that Jesus is good, Jesus is powerful, Jesus is perfect. And it's intuitive in all of us to want to live under good leadership and good rule. Father, I pray for all of us here this morning. First, for ourselves who have been in church for many, many years, that we know deep down in our hearts that Jesus must be King. I pray for all of us as brothers and sisters in Christ, especially those of us who struggle with this when circumstances in life turn out to be things that we don't quite expect, or when our ideas about God are being challenged. Help us to be able to reconcile the differences and still come to a conclusion that Jesus is still the good King, the powerful King, and the perfect King. I pray for those of us among us who have not yet come to know Jesus, that Father, today's word will speak to us to consider the importance of living under the rule of Christ. So Father, I pray that your word will minister to us and that will bear fruit in our lives so that we can all live in the domain that God you have intended. They can understand the duties that we have been entrusted, and we can understand the design of life that God you have made, that we can enjoy life as the way God you have intended. So help us, God, especially for the Bible class leaders as they lead in discussion, that the discussion will also be fruitful as we direct our minds and our thoughts to Jesus and His kingship over us. In Jesus' name, amen.